desert was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed in on you, like the air itself had weight. Mark had been in the wilderness many times before, but this was different. The land felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at him from the inside. They had set up camp near Black Canyon, an infamous place known for its jagged cliffs and deep ravines. The locals spoke about it in hushed tones, warning anyone who would listen to stay far away after dark. But Mark wasn't the superstitious type. He was here for the adventure, nothing more, nothing less. Jason and Olivia were eager for the hike, their excitement infectious. Jason had been Mark's best friend for years, always looking for the next thrill. Olivia, his sister, had joined them reluctantly. She was the practical one, always skeptical, always questioning. Still, the three of them made a good team. They had hiked through the most remote corners of the country and laughed in the face of danger. But something about Black Canyon didn't feel right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the canyon's shadows grew long and twisted, stretching across the earth like fingers reaching out. Mark noticed the stillness. It was more than the absence of sound. It was a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that seemed unnatural. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him. "Let's get the fire going," Jason said, breaking the silence as he knelt by the pile of wood they had gathered earlier. He struck a match and set the pile alight, the flames licking the dry wood and crackling loudly in the night. Olivia unpacked their gear while Mark stood by, watching the flickering light. The firelight cast an eerie glow over the surrounding cliffs, illuminating the jagged edges of the canyon walls that seemed to loom over them. There was no moon, only the stars, distant and cold. "You guys hear that?" Mark asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Olivia asked, glancing up from the camp stove. Mark frowned, straining his ears. "It's too quiet. I don't hear any animals or insects." Jason chuckled, tossing another log into the fire. "You're just spooked. It's fine. It's the desert. It's quiet." But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The air felt thick, like something was watching them. As they ate their dinner, Mark's eyes kept darting to the edge of the camp, where the darkness pressed in like a wall. The firelight was flickering more erratically now, casting long, distorted shadows. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't the usual desert breeze. It felt unnatural, colder than it should have been. Olivia didn't seem to notice. She was too busy telling Jason about some new documentary she had watched, her voice a little too loud in the oppressive silence. Mark tried to focus on her words, but his gaze kept drifting back to the dark. Then he heard it, a faint noise, like a twig snapping. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head toward the sound, but all he could see was darkness. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked. Jason and Olivia paused, looking at him. "Hear what?" Olivia asked. "That," Mark began, but the words died in his throat. Another noise, this time louder, a rustling, as though something large was moving just outside the firelight. "Probably an animal," Jason said dismissively. But Mark wasn't convinced. The sound was too deliberate, too careful. "All right," Jason said, standing up. "I'm going to check it out. Stay here." Before Mark could protest, Jason grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the dark. Olivia muttered something under her breath, clearly annoyed at Jason's brashness. "I'm going to bed," Olivia said, standing up to go to her tent. Mark stayed by the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in his gut. The wind had stopped now, and the silence was deafening. The fire flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then the voice. "Mark, come outside." It was Jason's voice, but distorted. It sounded wrong. The cadence was all off, like a bad imitation of Jason's voice. Mark froze. He gripped the flashlight, his hands shaking. "Jason?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He called again, louder this time. "Jason?" The silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mark stood there, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Something was wrong, and then he heard it again, but closer this time. "Mark, come outside." It was no longer Jason's voice. It was a twisted mockery of it, too low, too guttural, and the tone, like it was calling him, luring him. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. What should he do? Jason was out there, but that voice, it wasn't right. It wasn't him. He turned to Olivia's tent. Olivia, stay inside, he shouted, his voice shaking. The air around him seemed to tighten. He could feel something moving in the shadows, something watching him. Then something moved, quick, almost too fast to track. Mark whipped around, flashlight in hand, and for a split second he thought he saw something. A shape, too thin, too tall to be human, just beyond the firelight. Before he could react, there was a sudden rustling, followed by a scream. Jason's scream. It was cut short, a sharp, agonizing sound that made Mark's blood run cold. No, Mark shouted, running toward the sound. But the canyon walls seemed to stretch further, as if the distance had grown too long. He sprinted, panic setting in as the sound of Jason's voice, no, the thing's voice, echoed through the canyon. Mark, help me. The words were wrong. They were like a mocking version of Jason's voice, twisted and drawn out. Mark stumbled, falling to his knees as he reached the spot where the sound had come from. He scanned the area with the flashlight. Nothing. No sign of Jason. Just the sound of his own heavy breathing. And then the sound again. Thud. Something heavy hitting the ground. A wet, squelching sound. Mark turned, heart racing. There, at the edge of the firelight, was Jason. Or what had once been Jason. It was hunched over, its back arched in an unnatural way. Limbs too long, too thin. Its head was twisted as if it had been broken and reassembled. The face, it had Jason's face, but it was wrong. The eyes were wide, unblinking, black as night. The mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. The creature didn't move. It just stared at Mark with those empty eyes, and Mark could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into him, suffocating him. And then it spoke. Help me. Mark couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen. It wasn't Jason. It wasn't anything human. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. With a sudden, jerking motion, the creature lunged. Mark barely had time to react. He scrambled backward, his heart pounding, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The thing reached for him, its fingers too long, its nails too sharp. But before it could grab him, Olivia screamed. Mark turned, the flashlight flickering wildly, and saw her, her figure silhouetted in the distance, standing just outside her tent. Olivia, run! Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. But the creature didn't turn toward her. It only fixed its unblinking gaze on Mark. And then, in a moment of clarity, Mark realized, this thing, this Skinwalker, was not after her. It was after him. With all his strength, Mark pushed himself to his feet and ran, his legs burning with the effort, the sound of his breath filling his ears. The creature's footsteps were right behind him, too fast, too close. He didn't know how long he ran. His mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Finally, he saw the lights of their truck in the distance. Mark's hands were shaking as he fumbled for the keys, his breath ragged. He glanced back. The creature had stopped. It was standing in the shadows, watching him, waiting. Mark jumped into the truck, slamming the door shut. Olivia was already inside, her face pale, her hands trembling. Drive, Mark said, his voice frantic. Olivia didn't question him. She started the engine, and they sped off into the night, the truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. Mark didn't look back, he couldn't. But the image of the creature, the Skinwalker, was burned into his mind, a twisted reminder of what he had just escaped. They never spoke of it again. And Jason was never found.